Welcome to another edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. My name is Aljamal Binding. I'm the chair of the board, Movement Omaha for Race Equity. It's an organization that deals with anti-racism issues, community forums, issues we're trying to bring people together, facilitate conversations about racial dialogue, accountability, and part of our mission statement deals with transparency and accountability. And we've been around for over 10 years and actively involved in a lot more issues related to anti-racism within the last few years, looking at the administration, both locally and nationally and statewide. Today, we have a special guest with us, LeClara Gilreath, who has an MBA from Fremont. She also has a master's degree in history, undergraduate and graduate. And I know the undergraduate is in Lincoln. She attended the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and she's native Omaha. She's one of the few African American historians who deal with race issues that we're aware of. And as we review the book Roots of Justice, A History of Race and Racism in Nebraska, we've come to learn the valuable parts of history that have oftentimes been left out of our traditional history classes about African Americans in Nebraska. We know the history departments at post-secondary institutions have painted a jaded history of our contributions to the state, and its importance that move beyond some of the hero worshiping and the same old trivial dates and more into social justice issues and accomplishments that many African Americans have carved out in their existence in this apartheid state. Uh, we also know the Nebraska Historical Society has many articles that deals with history and so on, and many of our folks are not able to always reach them or know how to utilize them. And so one of the things we hope to see more people utilize the history of Blacks in Nebraska and go through some of these issues and articles to avoid some of the stereotypical recitations that go on in our system. LeClara has shared her interest in what takes place in the conduct of research on Black history in the state, and particularly in a hostile environment. And I want you to, LeClara, tell a little bit more about yourself, because I just gave a brief introduction, but say a little bit more who you are and give a little bit more background if you can.
Okay, again, my name is LeClara Gilreath. I born and raised in Omaha, Nebraska, went to University of Nebraska Lincoln for undergrad and University of Nebraska Omaha for my graduate degree in history. I've worked for many years with the Great Plains Black History Museum. I still work with the Great Plains Black History Museum, so not a shameless plug, but they do have programs going on once a month. So if you're not busy on the fourth Saturday of the month, we'll be talking about the Tulsa race riots. Um, I currently teach at Duchesne Academy of the Sacred Heart. I teach literacy with Girls Inc. I have one daughter. She's 18. She's a freshman in college. And yeah, that's me.
Good, good. Now, I want to start off. I had a chance to read the chapter you researched, The History of African Americans in Nebraska. And this is the book that it came out of, Roots of Justice, which is a book that people should get a copy of, particularly those who want to know about what Black people, Native Americans, Asians, and Latinos or Chicanos have done in Nebraska. It's an excellent book. But I want to talk a little bit more. What entailed or how long did you work on that project? What made you do that? And then how long did you work on that, particularly the chapter that you worked on?
So someone gave my name to Preston Love Jr., who was in charge of the chapter on African American history in Nebraska. I don't know who gave my name to him. I'm assuming Eric Ewing because again, I've done a lot of work with the Great Plains Black History Museum, but I'm not sure if it was him. And they just recommended me as somebody who would be great to do research when I was in grad school, one of my favorite parts about doing history at UNL was doing the research. I love to write the stuff, but I like to dig and find things that nobody else knew about. So, Preston Love contacted me and we got together, we had a few meetings, and he told me what he needed, and I just went out and I got to work. Um, I worked on the project for a few months. Again, most of what I did was the research. I went to the Historical Society a few times and gathered information from their website and sometimes in person, also going to libraries, talking to people in Lincoln, talking to people in Brownville, Nebraska, kind of just doing some digging, figuring out where to go and who to contact because a lot of the records weren't kept that great. And so I had to do a little bit digging more than I wanted to. And then there were other researchers who were also on the project and they kind of added to it. And we just all came together and put something in writing that turned out to be a really good piece of work.
Yeah. Now, some years ago, one African American professor, told me that in a history class that she was an undergraduate a while back, And a racist history teacher made the argument that enslavement of Africans were good for Black people. In other words, he basically justified slavery in the sense of how we benefited from it. When I asked her what she did about it, she basically told me she walked out of class. Some years later, I asked her again about it, and I thought she had gone and reported him, and I found out she just walked out of the class and didn't bust a grape or do anything. Nothing came from that endeavor. Have you experienced a similar mentality in your coursework at the university? I know you've been at a couple of different universities where some would say something that's so outlandish or racist or related to people of color, and particularly African Americans.
In my personal experience, no, which I'm grateful for. I have not really experienced something so outlandish. There have been a couple of comments here and there, but nothing that in your face. I have experienced a few things where people are just ignorant and they just don't know. And I take the opportunity to educate them. And the majority of the people I talk to in those situations are actually happy to get the information because it was just something they didn't know or misinformation or ignorance. Um, but nothing as crazy as slavery was good for Black people.
Yeah, I did a workshop years ago for the Office on Aging, and one of the white guys who I obviously had some issues said he brought the issue up of Africans who enslaved other Africans, and he was raising it not as a point of history or fact that which it was, but it was almost using as a dig as justifying, white blame was whites for slavery. And again, you hear these kind of comments, and you also have to go with the intonations and the mentality of the redneckish of the person to make sure you see the red on their neck, you know where you're coming from. But I know sometimes some of us don't push back and what I want to say briefly is that there was a person I work with, and I asked the person, I wasn't trying to be funny, have you ever called a white person a racist? And the person said, never. And I was shocked. I'm like, how do you live to be 56 years old and never call someone out? But let me switch over because it's not about me, it's about interview on this book. Over the years, I've worked and interviewed Adam Fletcher Sass as contrasts to about his writing efforts. And he's probably one of the most prolific writer. He's from Canada, and that's where he's at right now. And also, if you contrast some of his writings he's done on the webpage, he's probably produced more than all the African American historians and people in Nebraska, and particularly those who are scholars who got time on their hands to write, particularly with North Omaha. I'm talking about North Omaha. I'm not saying some other stuff here. Why do we have a white guy, who writes with such a long lineage and he got the productions there about he articles and so on. And we can't get some of us to write and tell our own stories. Why is it hard for us to do our own writing? We got this white guy from Canada who's got a prolific web page and books out, and some of us who get PhDs, we don't do that. Help me with that as a historian.
Um, this is it's a layered question, but one of the things I noticed in my work with the Great Plains Black History Museum is a lot of times it's hard just to get us to show up and to support us. So it is hard to continue to do things when we feel like there isn't an audience for it. Um, we a lot of times we feel like we're pushing things on people when they don't want them. And then in one or two encounters I had at the museum, I had people question my facts.
What do you
Uh,
mean? Help me with that concept.
we were talking about race riots in Nebraska, or well, really race riots in the Great Plains. And I had mentioned that Omaha had seen its fair share of race riots, and I named one after the murder of Eugene Nesbitt. And I was told that that was not what it was for, and that I should go talk to someone else, and that someone else could help me get my facts straight. Um, and this was a African American woman who said this. And so I went back and because then I started questioning myself and I said, well, maybe I didn't get my facts right. So I went and she said, and I didn't talk to whoever she suggested, but I looked at the Omaha World Herald archives, which is what she told me I should do. The person that she suggested I should talk to worked for the Omaha World Herald. So I went and I looked at the archives on my own and I said, no, I was completely right. But in hindsight, I think I knew I was right the whole time, but I still wanted to fact check myself. And it's kind of hard to be in spaces where we're pushing this history out there and nobody wants to take it. And then also, I will say to Adam Fletcher Sass's credit, he does great work.
Okay.
He was interested in writing a history that nobody else was interested in writing. He cultivated a little bit of a following and some support, and so he kept doing it.
Hmm.
Um, that's kind of where we lack. And maybe if he's older than I am, not by much, but he is older than I am. Maybe if I had started doing it before him, I might have been able to cultivate the following and do it on my own before him. Um, but I think those are the hardest things. It's not that we don't want to do it, it's just feeling like there's nobody out there who wants the information.
Okay.
So then you come along with this platform, and it clearly shows me that there are people out there who want the information. And then the other issue is having people question our abilities.
Hmm. Interesting. Also, I know if you don't have history teachers who look like us, particularly African Americans, and if you look at Creighton, UNO, UNL, you will find very few historians who are teaching at the academic level, PhD and so on. And I tell people a class was more profound. We was a class of Native American taught by a Native American when I was an undergraduate back from 73 to 76 when I was in Lincoln. But it was fascinating to get my eyes open with all that propaganda that we get about Native Americans. Then to have somebody who's authentic who can tell it from a indigenous point of view and also from someone who's not a jaded and doing the kind of the Trump stuff we go on. The other question I'm gonna ask you, the book has many interesting facts and historical events. Some of them I didn't even know, and I again grew up here, and some of the stuff I've read other pieces here and there. What did you find most interesting in your research? And I know you were doing the research for the chapter, but what struck you? Was there aha moment, as we say in church circles, was there epiphany for you in terms of that chapter?
I don't know if there was an epiphany, but the thing that shocked me was it shocked me, but it didn't because this is the United States. But that there was slaves in Nebraska. There were enslaved people in Nebraska. Usually, when you hear about Nebraska in the context of slavery and the Civil War, Nebraska's typically on the right side of history.
Mm,
Even when going back to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Nebraska was being brought in as a free state. There were no laws about slavery in Nebraska, whether they were preventing it or allowing it. There just were no laws. So the people that were coming in to settle, when they were settling in Nebraska, they just brought their enslaved people with them. Um, but a lot of times when you do kind of surface level research about the United States or US history and you look at individual states, Nebraska often shows up as a free state. So a lot of people don't pay attention to the fact that there probably were enslaved people. And so when I saw it and it was actual, fact information, I was like, well, look at that. Somebody put it down on paper.
hmm one of the things that hit me that, and I learned this late in life. I'm well into adulthood, almost senior citizen status, and Dr. Franklin Thomas was talking about after the lynching of Will Smith, or Willie Smith, I think, in 1919 September, we did
Will
the
Brown.
Will Brown. Sorry about it. Catch me on it. I was surprised, didn't know the guy George Smith. That's what I got confused. George Smith was lynched earlier. I didn't know anything
Mhm.
about him. And then I read Breslow's book, A Dirty Wicked Town, and he had a wonderful chapter about the lynching of George Smith. And it was almost like a microcosm of a repeating of what happened earlier, years later. So you got the same kind of mob justice that happened, and there was a questionable circumstance in both cases. Will Brown was much more hideous but again made national attention and people will see that picture as depicting of Nebraska. But my question somewhat is we got to do our own history and do it because obviously the hunter's not going to tell our history for us. The other thing, I was impressed with some of the contributions of African Americans in rural Nebraska and the impact of enslavement in Nebraska. Why is that frequently not taught in more of our education institutions? Because I was born in Hastings, and there's a lot of history about how blacks got the history in Hastings. You got those different towns that happened where blacks came to live. Some are very famous. But why we don't talk more about rural Nebraska, and particularly some of us who came in the late 1800s and the early 1900s to the state?
I think it goes back to what you just said, that we have to tell our own histories. There's nobody out there that is telling the history. I'm from Omaha, so when I look into things related to local history, I typically look into Omaha history. Every now and again, I'll branch out and look at Nebraska history, but time and resources don't always present themselves that easily. So it's not as easy to go out and say, "Hey, I'm going to Hastings, that's a 2 hour drive there and then a 2 hour drive back. So
Right.
I can, sit down for maybe 4 or 5 hours and do some research. I have to allot the time for that. And life is life. So I can't make that same excuse for or reason for everyone, but I think we just have to tell our own histories. And so we have to find the people that will tell our own histories. We have to get out there and do the work. And if there's nobody that is willing to do the work, then it's not ever going to be done. And so that's why I kind of like this project, because it did focus more on the histories of African Americans in other places other than Omaha. And that was one of the reasons I was drawn to it. When Preston Love approached me and asked me to do it, I was like, yes, I love this, because why aren't we talking about other places? Why is everything so focused on Omaha?
Right. And by the way, I mentioned I was born in Hastings. I was in a conference, I think it was Nebraska Peace, and I met a white guy named Walter. Well, I met a white guy, was may not Walter L. Miller, but he gave me a book about it. It's kind of messed up, but it's called The U.S. Naval Ammunition Depot, and it's about Hastings, Nebraska. There were a number of black people who got recruited and brought to Nebraska, and they worked there. There were a number who were killed. In the official version, it was like one or two died, and according to some of the people who know the history, they said more died in that ammunition dump. But again, at World War II, Nebraska had, if you go into the Hastings, you see all these mounds there, and that's where they used to bury some of the old ammunition remains or whatever there. But again, people always ask, about Hastings, and I know there was a Mullins there. There was a woman named Vi, Mrs. Vi, who opened a flower shop. And I went to university in Lincoln. There were a number of African Americans I met who were from Hastings, but we oftentimes left there and came to Omaha or Lincoln or bigger cities. The other thing that was interesting about this book is that back in the days, if black people in Hastings wanted to come to Omaha for the weekend, they cleaned out a cattle truck, washed it out. I'm sure there was a stink in there, and they didn't let them ride on buses like other people, so they had to ride in segregated cattle truck that was cleaned out, but it really wasn't cleaned out. It's the odor still in there, and they would come up for the weekend and then go back. So it was almost like their Greyhound bus, and it shows you the apartheid nature of Hastings and as well as Nebraska, the 1940s and 50s, I guess. So I want to throw that out. Now I'm gonna switch up again. There were many doctors and other professional elected officials in Nebraska. Where do you find that information? I know that it's mentioned in this chapter, but how did you find a lot of that information about other professionals and things like that? People.
A lot of it, historical societies, they have information on that. Sometimes you got to go to the place to look that up. Some of it, I'll be honest with you, wasn't me that found it. It was some of the other people that were doing the research that found that
By the way,
information.
how many people were with you working on that chapter? Because I saw there's a litany of other names mentioned. How many were there? About three or four people you
So
guys
there
were
were
with?
three other researchers. There was myself, the lead researcher, but then there was also Portia Love and Heather Fryer. We didn't really work together on the project, but we all kind of compiled our research and then we handed it off. And Adam Fletcher Sass, again, wrote it all up and put it together using
Okay.
the research that was done. And I believe he might have even added in a little bit of his own research as well.
Okay.
Um,
He put his flavor in. He stuck his little fingers in the cake and made some pie.
yes.
Okay. Yeah, I suspect he would the way he's been writing. Yeah. The other question I was going to ask you, and I didn't ask you earlier, is have you published anything? Have you written stuff, freelance or some academic or local papers yourself?
I have not yet. I have some things that I'm in the works for. Most of the things that I do are when I do my research are typically for lectures. So I haven't written anything that has been published. When I was in grad school, of course, I had to do research. My focus in grad school was actually relationships between Native Americans and African
Oh,
Americans, because I
wow.
feel like that never gets talked about enough. We always hear about relationships between African Americans and white people or Native Americans and white people, but never the two. But clearly they were in the country together, so they had to do something.
So,
Um, so
Claire, quickly on that, then, are you talking about African Americans and Native Americans in Nebraska, or are you talking about the people who are in the South? Because I know there are a lot of interracial marriage between Native Americans and African Americans. I've been reading some of those books of the different Choctaw and you name it, people who brought them in during slavery, and some of them actually were enslaved with the natives. But there's all kinds of things. Are you Nebraska history, or are you talking about nationally of the
national
interrelationship?
history. There's
Okay,
there's not enough records in Nebraska, unfortunately. When I was doing my research, it actually focused more on Oklahoma, mostly because that's the site where most native populations were removed to,
the
especially
Trail of Tears, yeah.
the five civilized tribes all got removed there. But there's just not enough information on natives and their relationships with African Americans in Nebraska.
Okay.
Um, if anybody's listening and they have information, I'd love to see it.
Yeah, there's some articles that I've seen recently, something I ran across. It talks about the relationship, but it's some other stuff I have to look at. But on the national level, and it was something I'm reading recently that it was much more extensive about enslavement against a book I'm looking at right now. I don't
Yeah.
have it in front of me, but it just talks about how some tribes did not accept slavery and some did. And then I know
Mm,
in Mexico at one point told the American racist government they would not return enslaved people who ran away back. So again, we don't learn that in our traditional history classes that
right.
UNO and so on. Within the last month, I was working with an African American genealogist regarding my own family history and found out that our mother's side was enslaved by a person named Thomas Binding and some brothers. One of a group of our family, as we call it, our clan, spelled with a C, not the K, obviously, moved to Mississippi. The other went to Alabama after the 1853, right around that time. And so this person is Marlene Binding. I interviewed her a while back. We have the same last name. And you said this brought great pride to our family, especially our struggles that we know what our mother went through in East St. Louis, Illinois, where she's from. Some would like to explore those records. Why is genealogy significant for some of us? And I use that as a historian looking at you. Why do we need to know about our individual stuff as African Americans in general, from your perspective?
I think it goes back to the history of slavery. Both, I mean, both coming from Africa, but also being in the United States or in the Americas, they split us up. Husbands and wives and parents and children and sisters and brothers. So, we have family members all over the country, sometimes all over the world, and we have no idea who we're related to because our records weren't kept as opposed to the records of other races of people. They have that history. And then, we didn't have the technology we have now back in the 1800s. So if a husband and wife were a mother and son were split up after, they have no way to find each other. And yes, there was some movement within the Freedmen's Bureau that helped people find lost relatives, but sometimes once the families were split, they were just split. So to find that information and to actually know where you came from is powerful.
Wow. One of the things when I was teaching in Black studies and also when I was teaching Black families in the School of Social Work, they actually got rid of that class because they got tired of dealing with Black issues and African American men who knew how to talk very assertive. Again, it's literally an all-white department right now, racist as it is. A guy who wrote a book, Herbert Gutman, and he talks about Black families who, after slavery, how they went all across the country to find their kinfolks. And he basically said that got together and intact. And he said slavery in and itself didn't always destroy our families and that we were very much family oriented. And he showed linkage of how people went across the country once, became emancipated, deal with that. We got a couple more minutes. I want to ask you a couple of questions before we open it up. Um, Black studies is under attack. And again, as with other academic departments dealing with race issues because of the current racist redneck administration, what can we do to circumvent the recent barrage of the current administration, both at the state and the local and the federal level, to help us promote our culture and history in Nebraska? It's kind of like a magic wand question, but from your vantage point, as someone who's into culture and history, from your vantage point, what can we do to reverse some of the stupidness and silliness and racism that's going on about our culture and our history in our society?
Whew. I don't know that
Is that
we,
one of them questions you got to unpack, or should I
yeah, I
ask it?
mean,
Should I have
I
broken
don't
it
know
down
that
to one
we,
question or whatever? I mean, Archibald has a way of talking real fast and compounding questions and nerves, and I'm speaking little robotics and whatever. Go ahead.
I don't know that it can be unpacked or even reversed. I think we have to just keep doing it. And I know that might sound like an oversimplification, but there are programs out there that will teach the history. And again, I'm kind of going back to the Great Plains Black History Museum. For years, I lectured at the Great Plains Black History Museum. I would put the information out on social media. The museum would put the information out on social media. And yes, they were on Saturdays. And I know that sometimes people have conflicts and they couldn't show up. but the information would be there. And for a lot of, with the exception of the month of February, because we'll show up in February, but for a lot of the lectures that I had, the only attendees in the audience were my family and friends. So thanks, family and friends. I have some really supportive family and friends, but we have to want it.
Yeah,
So yeah, if the administration is attacking it because we put it out there and we did discover that people actually want to learn this information, but are they actually trying to learn it? So it's the organizations that exist that continue to do this work, they have to keep doing the work
right,
because we cannot depend on our universities and colleges to continue doing the work. Some of them are great, and again, they will fall on the right side of history, but others will do whatever they need to do to make sure the money keeps coming.
right, right,
And if that means getting rid of departments and classes, then that means getting rid of departments. So we have to support our local institutions, our local historians, even our local politicians that are trying to advance these causes. And we got to show up. Again, Great Plains Black History Museum, we had a whole workshop a couple of weeks ago about voting and the history of voting rights. And then even in February, I had one at my church about the history of voting and the importance of voting in Nebraska. And the one at my church, maybe 20 people showed up. And it was a good discussion, but
by
we
the way, what
couldn't.
church was that? Because I didn't know churches did stuff like that on Saturdays or on outside of their Sundays.
Yep, Zion Baptist Church.
Oh, they do educational events at Zion?
We don't always do educational events, but they were looking for a Black History program, and since that's my home church, and we are in an election year in terms of, midterm elections for the House and the Senate. I chose to focus on voting rights. So we
Okay.
watched, we screened there's a documentary out. It's available on Peacock. So if you have Peacock, it's free and it's called Lowndes County, The History of Black Power. I'm probably misnaming the title. But it's all about how this black community in Lowndes County fought for their right to vote. And so we had this. I brought in, we had a panel discussion from some amazing people, Michaela Danner, Sir Wayne Wardlow, Chris McCroy, and Mariah Johnson. And they all came in. So we had different people from different professions and different age groups. And then we had a surprise guest show up in Brenda Council. And one of the things she said to me that shocked me was that in the last election, only about 23% of the voting population in North Omaha actually went out and voted in the election.
Wow.
I'm not sure where she got her numbers from. I didn't fact check her, but I didn't feel like I needed to. I feel like if she said it, there must be some accuracy to it.
Well, well,
But
one of the things, Brenda's been around for a while, and again, she's
yep,
a couple of years older than me. I like to mention that because she was in school before me in Lincoln, but she normally knows her data and stuff. I give her
yes.
credit. As a matter of fact, I made a joke with her the other day. We were talking on the phone, and I said, my late wife, and I was telling my son, I said, my son, he takes his brain from his grandmother and his mom, and he takes the looks from me. And Brenda says, well, I beg to differ with you on that one. So I had to bust out laughing. I said, hey, Brenda, come on now. You still cut deep, don't you? But again, we go way back and we involved in the struggle and so on. But I know we're getting closer, but something else hit me is I know we got 17,000 people join out for Juneteenth. People come off of that stuff. They came off a Bud Crawford thing and like that. Again, we got an African American bookstore. It looks like, need more people support there. And again, I was surprised you told me the church actually does educational events because I haven't heard of churches doing that. I'm being here all my life, so I don't go to church anyway. But my point is I'm glad to hear churches move beyond the spiritual world and get into some of the sectarian things of helping educate our people because our school system is not teaching our history well. And if we can't go to a church or our community centers to do it, where can we go as African Americans? We look at the Jewish people, they got their synagogues and they got their Jewish community center, but some of
Mhm.
our institutions don't do a good job of augmenting the education because it's obvious looking at graduation rates and post-secondary situation jobs. We're not there. Before we open up, any other last comments or something before we open up to the participants to ask you questions or make comments about something we've said, and particularly you, LeClaire?
I guess the only comment I really have is I just kind of want to say what I've already said. We got to get our people to support us. You mentioned the Jewish, they have their synagogues and their community centers. Well, they get people to go to those things. We got to support us.
Well,
We
maybe
can keep putting the information out there, but somebody's got to be there to receive it.
right. And I know sometimes it's hard to expect people to participate in a book reading group if they can't read well, or if they don't know how to read beyond the third grade, which has been a controversial issue and so on. So those are
Mhm.
issues we got to solve for ourselves because obvious Malcolm has taught us and Martin that again, there are a lot of things we got to do on our own and stop waiting for somebody to be just a great white savior, the Superman. Folks, so this is right at halftime, as we say, not halftime of football or whatever, basketball. But anyone make a comment? Mrs. Gilreath is here. I didn't tell the story that I know her family from way back when we were kids, and one of her uncles and I were classmates in grade school as well as college, and know each other and the family way back when we were little kids. So it's been a long history knowing the Gilreaths. Other feedback, other reactions. We're also on Facebook Live, so if somebody wanted to say something there, we'll relay it through Andile.
So, question for you, Miss Gilreath. How you doing today? You good?
Hey, my good friend Poto, I'm
All right, there
good.
you
How are
go. There you
you?
go. I'm sitting there outside relaxing. What inspired you to do this type of work? I know this is a yeoman's work. A lot of sleepless nights. I know you've been doing this for quite a while, even before it was a thing. I mean, tell us about what inspired you to do all this.
Honestly, it goes back again to a teacher I had when I was in the eighth grade. I had a social studies teacher, Mr. Morris, and Mr. Morris said Abraham Lincoln did not free the slaves. And as an eighth grader, that was mind blowing. And then I just kind of carried that with me. But when I got to undergrad, I realized that not everybody else was taught this same thing. And so when I
Mm,
learned that
right.
everybody else didn't know this same piece of information, that the
Mm-hmm.
Emancipation Proclamation didn't actually free the people in the North, it was only for the rebelling
Mm-hmm.
states. And if the rebelling states had won, do we really think they would have let their slaves be free? Um, so when I learned that other people didn't know this, I said, okay, well, we got to get somebody out there that's going to tell our histories,
Mm-hmm.
learn our histories, and then teach our histories.
Mm. And what professor at UNL inspired you the most?
At UNL, probably Dr. Combs.
Dr. Combs. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, he
Dr.
used to call
Combs. Yeah.
everybody scholar, and I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Boy, who's Dr. Combs? Okay. Good. Other questions, other feedback. I saw we got somebody joining us from Lincoln. I ain't gonna call your name out here, but I know you had something to do with this project too. So other feedback, reaction. Mr. Gildery is answering questions, reacting to feedback.
Follow-up question for you. Um, what do you think is then something that the next generation, what I mean by that, those individuals who are in their early 20s, teenagers, what do you kind of want to teach them about our history and how to kind of move forward and navigate in this new era, new society?
Whenever I focus on teaching the history of African American people, I always focus on resiliency and triumph. There are a lot of ways you can tell the stories of African Americans, and there is tragedy and suffering and death and war and so many things. But every single time we have those situations, African Americans triumph and are victorious. And I won't say 100% victorious, and I won't say that things are great, but I like to focus on the stories of like the Harriet Tubmans, and I know she's a popular name that lots of people use, but even the some of the lesser known names, I like to talk about the Shirley Chisholms. I like to talk about those so that they know that even when times get hard, times were much harder before,
Oh,
we
yeah.
can
Oh,
still
yeah.
be successful and we can still
Mhm.
be great and we can still be amazing. And so if they learn about these people and pick an individual who did something great, then maybe they can be inspired to continue learning and then also be an individual who does something great.
Wow. You know, as you mentioned that, I also pushed Mary Lou Hammer, we talk about what she did in Mississippi and how much torture she got down in the South. Obviously, it was a difference between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, one being the North and the South, but they called holy hell down South from them. I'm not going to call people names like whatever, saltines down South. But again, it was really difficult to deal with your history and culture in those areas. Other questions, other feedback from other folks. By the way, is there a follow-up to this booklet that you know of? Is there part two that you guys plan on doing, or do you know anything they're gonna do some other writings? Because I like the way you blended the native as well as you in the book. It has Latinos and Asians and other folks in here. Was there another long range thing that you're aware of that you guys are working on or gonna look at from a historical point of view?
To my knowledge, this was the project, and honestly, when we did the project, we did way more than we were supposed to. They wanted like 5,500 words. I don't know who they thought was going to write just 5,500 words, but if you looked at the project, it's far more than that.
Hmm.
So, to my knowledge, the I won't say the one project, but the hope from the Truth and Reconciliation History Project was that people would take the information and then kind of take it, read it, learn about it, and then hopefully someone else would pick it up and take it from there. Or not even just someone else, but multiple people would just continue to learn on their own. But just kind of to give them a starting point so that they had something to go off of.
Wow. As you were talking, it just hit me, LeClaire, Clara. This would be something that the African American Commission should read. You got a number of those who are not from Nebraska, and I'm sure they're going to have the appreciation of what all people have done in Nebraska. And so, even that one chapter, it'd be nice if there was opportunity for a presentation at one of their meetings, or make it kind of like an informal, so what you would call a colloquial, or some kind of a symposium, or even some kind of discussion group. Because again, if you don't know about all the great things that Nebraskans have done, and those who are imports from elsewhere, and those of us who grew up here, we like to say where you from, what high school you go to, and sometimes we don't let you get into the house until we can baptize you, so you feel with the holy struggle of Nebraska blacks. Because I see all these handkerchiefs. I slip it. I see these people coming in here and they want to claim the fame and fortune, but you got to remember they slid into Nebraska where we created the clean sidewalks. But anyway, it's very important to do that. There's another question, or something that came through the chat for you here. What other projects do you want to tackle next?
I would like to do more. Well, eventually I'm gonna go after a PhD, but
Okay.
that's in the works, but it's a long range goal. And that's more of a personal goal. I would like to talk more about like the history of citizenship in the country. Um, Especially now with the 14th Amendment kind of being under attack. I would also like to work on projects that just, again, educate people. I'm currently a history teacher. I consider myself a fact-based teacher, so I always teach facts. I don't teach theories. I don't teach opinions. I teach facts. And one of the greatest things about this country is we put our facts on paper. So I don't have to make anything up. When it's out there, it's out there. But I would like for us to get to a place where we actually look at facts and examine what they are for what they are, and then spread that information, and again use it to teach us, to encourage us as African Americans, as people of African descent, to triumph. Use it to find that resilient spirit that those enslaved people had as they were fighting to no longer be enslaved, whether that be through escaping or through fighting in the Civil War. Let's find that resilient spirit and get it back and keep educating ourselves. So any project I'm tied to is always about educating people so that they can find that encouragement, because I want us to be encouraged because we're great.
Right. I like the way you say, when this country teaches to put our facts on paper. I'm saying, hey,
Yeah,
there's some people who you give them all the facts, slap upside the head with a fact, they're going to
that
make up
is
their
true.
own reality. So, as that African proverb, knowledge never bends to ignorance. So, I look at these folks who don't want to do the work or hard work and they want to make up stuff. Or I look at some of these nonprofits, they'll put their staff members on Facebook and call it outcomes. I'm like, hold it. What's the data? How are we doing better? So again,
Yeah,
we got to get more demographics and facts out there instead of some of these picture shows that we
yeah.
see of these clown shows or whatever the last picture show. But anyway, other feedback, other reactions. I see. Is there something else in the chat? Anything else? I want to go back to Adam Fletcher Sass book, and like I said, I promote it, I recommend it, and it's so on the Omaha Black History. Did you have a chance to ever critique or read the inside? Because I actually wrote a review on this. I like it so much. I did hear some different feedback. We did a critique it at our Black History conference we had on it, and so on. But have you had a chance to engage him on this book itself at any point?
I did not. We talked briefly, but it was mostly over this project that we did together. I read the book a long time ago, so long ago that it is new facts have entered my brain and those facts have exited. But you read it. What when you said you critiqued it, what did you find? What did you find that needed critiquing?
Well, number one, if you let's you go back to the World Herald sources. One of the things was I know he repeats stuff a little bit, and that was mentioned at the conference, and he accepted criticism because he said sometimes stuff was so important you had to move another way in that. The other thing I know that he had so much information that I wish there was a way he could expand it in some chapters. In other words, as an author, you get to pick what you want to pick. And there were some areas I wish he would elongate it or talk more about it. And then the other thing I liked, or at least I really liked about, is the fact that he told me, and even then, that many of our African American institutions, churches, so on, do not have written histories of how they evolved and got together. And he had some of that in the book. I like that. I also think it should be used in elementary as well as secondary and high school because, again, Nebraska history is very important. It's not more about Arbor Day and all the silliness and the rednecks and all those kind of people who were oppressors and Malcolm X. I mean, we love Malcolm X. I think he's like a deity to some of us. But again, this book gets some local people who we never hear about these different. I learned about fraternities and sororities. I didn't know they were that prominent reading some of this book. And so even though when I invited some of them, they didn't show up, some other folks and so on. But I just think it's almost required reading his book. And I also think he could do some collaboration with some other people to talk about what's happened today as a result of something that happened a long time ago. But I think sold many copies, about $25 a piece. But I think more people should read this book because it gives you a greater appreciation that we're not in this struggle alone and that we're standing on other people's shadow. And again, what I like about him is he's kind of fanatic about writing, and we need to get more people who are writers. Because I can tell you, the number of people I went to school with, I've never seen a piece of paper where they've written anything, even a comic book, So just like see more of us writing more and reading more.
Yeah, I agree.
Other reactions. By the way, did you in the book that you critique are working on, how did the other chapters go with you? Did you have a chance to have input to those other groups, or was there any interaction between the natives, the Latinos, the Asian chapter writers, and the stuff? Did you guys ever come together to talk about all that together, or no?
No, we didn't. So the person who was in charge, whose name is escaping me right now, with the University of Nebraska that was in charge of the whole project, was really intentional about getting groups of people that were in those, in those ethnicities. So African American history should be written by African Americans. Native American history or indigenous history should be written by Native Americans, etc. So we didn't really come together to work on anything other than we had a couple of um, town hall type meetings where we met. But even then, it was mostly separated by the different groups in the story. So.
The other thing I would say about this is that I would love to see a coalition once a year where we bring people together statewide to talk about people of color. I know years ago, Teresa Barman Cagney, who was a former chair of the social work department, she participated. I think Matthew Shelley did in Lincoln. They had a kind of a conference about people of color, and they bring all the scholars in Nebraska together. And then all of a sudden, I think one of the governors or somebody called drift of it and stopped that. But they used to have a statewide conference, more academicians. This book could be open up to all people where you bring all these groups together once a year. And those of us who may live in Scottsbluff, I was just there this past week or so, you could do a Zoom type or a Facebook Live to bring people to talk about the contributions that people do in rural areas. And even some of the libraries have some cultural events and they could come together. But yeah, I just think those kind of things all cointel and maybe a future project to get all of us to come together and talk about our rich history and not have to, rely on, calls, Tucker or these other kind of national pundits to share our stories. Other
Yeah.
feedback, we got about 15 minutes or so. Other things. Someone raised a question. Have you ever been invited to speak at OPS History Department, high school, for example, your favorite one, Northwest?
Well, my favorite one is actually North.
Oh, not
Yeah,
Northwest. Oh, wait, hold it.
yeah.
Oh, Wait, is that where you went? Okay,
Yes.
I'll pray for you, as they say.
Um, I have so way back in the day, and I say that because even though I don't look as old as I am, I'm no spring chicken. Um, I did work with the Making Invisible Histories Visible project that OPS was doing for many years. I worked in the very first year, I worked as kind of just like a co-teacher. Um, and I was
Wait.
just
Use the
out of
word
grad school.
co-teacher. What does co-teacher mean when you said that
So
program?
the way the project was set up in that very first year was they had teachers that were from that worked at OPS in some sort of social studies department at somebody's school. I don't know where they all came from. And then they had co-teachers who were not with OPS but were either scholars at UNL or UNO or had just recently graduated. I had just recently graduated when I applied for it, I got it. So the reason I was a co-teacher and not an actual teacher is because I wasn't a teacher and I was just maybe I graduated in December and the program happened in the summer that following year. So I was just a few months out of grad school. So I did work on that. If you look up Making Invisible Histories Visible and you look at the very first year, I believe it was 2010, and go to churches, that was the group I worked on. We did a history of Black churches in Omaha. And years after that, they invited me back as a speaker. So those are the only times I've been invited to speak with OPS. I'm willing to speak with OPS or do some sort of event, but they don't really tap into me.
Well, don't take it personally. I talked to Donna Pope, Dr. Donna Pope. She said she's not been invited in there. I've been invited maybe twice in my whole life, even though I've been able to teach at the university, Metro, Nebraska Methodist College, Black Studies, social work. But they're not going to let me in because my mother was involved in that busing case and dragged them in like a screaming dog, and they lost the case. So they didn't want none of our family inside the building. But so another question for you, go back to this here, is that as we're looking in terms of teacher education, did you go through that to become a school teacher? Are you a certified school teacher in high school then?
I am certified to teach in high school now. I had a really long, winding, scenic route that I took to get to become a teacher. But when I graduated from UNO with my master's in history, I thought that I would find a job right away in history. And apparently, it's just not that easy. And it definitely wasn't that easy in 2010, 2011. And so I just went to work in corporate America. So I didn't get certified to teach in teaching until the opportunity presented itself at Duchesne.
So how many classes did you have to take after you left to get your teacher's certificate?
I had to go through 2.5 years of classes. So, and all I didn't want to do it as a master's degree. I could have gone more and gotten a third master's degree, but I feel like two is enough. All I want now is the PhD. So it was about 2.5 years of virtual education through University of Nebraska at Kearney because they have a permit program that allows you to teach in the history that you went to school in and got a degree in while you learn, while you get the certification.
Okay. You know, a little side story of me, I was going to be a school teacher. And then final year, I had a chance of student teaching under a lesbian who was working with high school equivalent students in Lincoln. And she was from Cuba. She was brilliant. I mean, this woman just knew all kinds of stuff and kind of revolutionized. And so my last semester, I went in to work with her with those migrant students. And they told me if I teach under her or work with her that semester, they wouldn't give me a teaching certificate. And that's how I never got into the school system. Plus, I knew I would last probably about 6 months in the OPS or the schools in the way that I talk. And then when I came back from Africa, I wanted to get my certification. And they basically told me I had to take almost a year and a half just to get back into the system. Like, it ain't worth that. So I never did it. But I do know they got all these teacher qualifications. They're dropping some time to get more teachers in the classroom today. But back then, they could weed you out if you were a black male and had a progressive mentality about black family and black children. Because again, that's how I got kicked out of the social work department. They got tired of teaching about the black family, so they said I was too Afrocentric for them indirectly, and they wanted some Beckys and some daughters of the Confederates there. But anyway, that's a little slide joke. Anyway, if you had to, some question is, if you had to create a write of Black history curriculum for high school or elementary school, what would it focus on from your perspective?
I don't know if I'd have one focus. I would try to teach everything, which is ambitious given that
Wait,
we
wait,
only
wait,
got
wait, wait,
about
wait, wait. What do you mean
we only got
everything?
about
That's like
40
creating the
weeks.
world. Hold on, give me some specifics. The question is,
I would
very
start in
focused.
Africa.
Okay.
So if we're talking Black studies, it depends on if we're talking Black studies and covering the entire diaspora, or are we just covering Black studies from
You got the magic
Omaha,
wand.
Nebraska?
Again, you can
Or
control it. You in charge of the Department of
okay.
Education since they don't like us and don't let us work in that department anymore.
Well, if it were up to me and let's say because again we got 40 weeks to teach these lessons. So packing everything in 40 weeks is sometimes it's a lot to ask sometimes, especially because history doesn't stop. Every day there's some sort of new history that happens. So if I were to just focus on, let's say, African American studies, meaning we would talk about Africans in the Americas, I would start in Africa with just the history of Africa, and then I would focus a lot more on the countries in Africa where most of the people came from that came to the Americas during slavery. So we go all the way back before the 15 and 1600s just to look at Africa, its rich history, all of the beautiful things. Then we'd go to slavery in Europe and the Americas, and then focus a little bit more specifically on the United States, mostly because I focus more on the United States. I think the United States history is fascinating. It's not always a pretty history, but I think it's a fascinating history. And so then I would just kind of take us through slavery, rebellions, the Civil War, emancipation, Reconstruction, kind of all of those things. And I would focus more on the good because again I like to encourage, so I'm not afraid to or teach the bad, and I won't shy away from teaching the bad, but I also feel like we don't focus enough on the good. And I think it'd be a little bit more fun to focus on the good, and then I would just kind of finish with like I'd finish out with music, 70s music, Gap Band, Parliament, uh and then I take us into
Wait. This
90s
ain't no plug
R&B.
show. We ain't be talking about the music you like. Hold on. I was
Hey,
talking about Miles Davis and John Coltrane. You gonna slip that in
yeah, I
and
mean them too. I love
Nina
I
Simone.
love
Okay,
John
okay. I can
Duke
out talk you.
Ellington.
Go again.
Yeah, Duke Ellington, In a Sentimental Mood. That's one of my favorite songs. So I would just we would finish with music though,
I hear
because I
you.
feel like music has a way of just kind of drawing us all in and making us feel happy. And we got great songs. There are certain songs, and they prove it in social media now, where everybody hears the song and everybody starts singing. They can cut the track out and the whole audience is still singing. So
Kind of
I
like
would focus on all of the history, but I would end it with joy because somehow, no matter what, we always find a way to find some joy.
yeah, LeClara, as you say that, one of the things that I was reading a book recently, and it talks about us as African Americans, it says we have a lot of pain, but we also have a lot of joy. And you can't separate them. Sometimes in the most bleakest moment, and again, I'm not talking religion here, I'm saying we bring humor in something that's supposed to be painful because that's
Yes.
how we survive, because as people who from the diaspora, we come from not only the continent, but here, but we've been able to, circumvent some of these issues that other people couldn't do. So it's that's one of the things. But going back to the music thing, I sometimes ask people the question, it's a trivial question. If you had to type in the top three musicians that you would have dinner with or be with, and it costs a lot of money, who would you pick? And you'd be surprised the number of people who they pick. But again, we all have this universality of, even if you don't speak the language, music is a bringing factor. There's another question here, and we got about 5 minutes left. Who is your Mount Rushmore of civil rights leaders? So if you had to pick
Ooh.
one, who is your go-to person?
Fannie Lou Hamer. I give credit to Martin Luther King Jr. because he did a lot of work. Um, and civil rights movement doesn't progress without him. Um, Shirley Chisholm,
Hmm.
and probably Harriet Tubman. I'd go back to Harriet Tubman.
Wow. Very good. Very good. As we say, we gods respect other gods. When people are at that top or peak, we cannot find fault with those people who've allowed us to climb on their shoulders and go forward. We're down to the last few minutes. I want to give you a chance. Any closing comments you want to share to our listening audience before we're viewing audience or participants before we hold on. One last question jumped in. Has your passion and focus on African American history been able to shine at the current school that you're teaching at?
Absolutely. Um, I will say one of the things about the administration that I love is that they support what I teach. It's a smaller school, but recently the College Board has now started teaching AP African American Studies. We have a smaller school, so we don't teach it every year. We alternate it every year with AP Psychology, and that's just because it's an elective course. It's not required. But even in my U.S. history class, whenever there's an opportunity to teach some sort of Black history, I teach it. We just got done talking about World War II. We're a little behind schedule. Don't tell anybody, but we're a little behind schedule. We just got
Wait,
done talking about World War II, and I put in the 6888, and I make sure we talk about the Central Post Directory Battalion and how those women went over there and sorted the backlog of mail. We talked about the Double V campaign, victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. How the A. Philip Randolph reached out to FDR to get him to pass an executive order to stop discrimination in war-related industries. And I think maybe because I focus so heavily on facts, I don't make anything up. My administration supports me. So I won't say it's been without any issues at all, but I have a really supportive administration, and they know that what I'm teaching is accurate. And I'm not trying to give anybody my opinion, or however, if they pick my opinion up, it's a good one. But I don't try to give anybody my opinion. I just try to tell them this is what happened and this is what you can pull from it.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things, LeClara Gilreath, I really appreciate you being here, throwing out some heavy light and helping us understand the importance of history and hopefully get more people to participate in studying our history, because I know that history helps us to go forward. And again, history is a moving chain, as we would say. We have the past, the present, the future, and they're all connected. And so sometimes we miss that. So really appreciate you being here. And hopefully we'll get a chance to give you a chance to share some more about why history is important and how we get more of our people to write about history and be more engaged in particularly Nebraska history and even Omaha history, so that we don't have Adam Fletcher out there by himself on that limb and a bunch of ignoramuses just always criticizing versus producing, do what we're about. So really appreciate you. One thing I would close out, and I would say, number one, I was at a Anytown event this weekend, and I talked to a group that we haven't broken in different groups. And one of the things that they shared with me is that I'm not going to mention the high school named after the guy who was against integration back in the day, but they said they have a white historian who's teaching the class, and they alluded to her not as being that good in this particular session. And what I'm saying is that we need to have historians who have a sense of indigenous roots. And again, I know there's some great white historians, so I'm not saying being white, you can't write about the African American experience. But something is wrong when you go to the UNO Education Department and the main people who teach don't look like us, don't live in our communities or even frequent our culture. And it'd be the same way as if they let me teach about religion and I'm an atheist, okay? Or they let me teach about history of the Israelites who were involved in the genocide. And again, I'm very much anti-Zionist, but at the same time, there's some things you just don't bring some people in to teach about certain things when you know they have a certain level of contempt for your people, your group. And so this is why we need to be able to speak truth to power and get some of us to push back, because right now we have to know that we did not arrive here on the 747 or the Mayflower, and that we as African Americans and people of color have struggled and will continue to struggle. So I would hope that more and more will be part of the resistance movement. But I'm reminded of Martin Luther King when he talks about the silence of his friends when he wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail, which I consider one of the best classic pieces written by a social justice warrior. Obviously, I love Malcolm X, and I think he's number one in my world, but I cannot take away from the great contributions of other women and people, and even our own community. The 7 women who brought the desegregation case, they were women, and they were not associated with any major institutions. So we got to be able to climb and do what we got to do, because if we don't do it for our communities, then again, it pushes to the next generation. So I'd like to say again, Mrs. LeClara Gilreath, I appreciate you being here, and hopefully get a chance to throw out some more light to help bring a sense of education to families and people in our community. And as I always like to end by saying 2 things, well, 3 things today. If you don't have your sunglasses on, you might get retina damage from some of these conversations. But as we always end, may the force be with you. Baroko.